So anyway, I had this great idea for a fantasy book. You see, there's this guy, just a normal everyday sort of chap, and he finds this magic ring and he thinks, wow, this is amazing. I can do all this great stuff with this ring. But what he doesn't know is the ring is really evil. It was made by this bad, evil sorcerer. Anyway, things develop a bit and they decide they've got to destroy this ring. But it's okay because our hero has a friend who's a wizard as well, but he's a good wizard, and he's really friendly with these huge giant eagles. So they come up with this plan. They're going to sit him on this eagle. They're going to fly him to this big volcano where he can just. The what? The Lord of the what? Oh, oh well. Back to the drawing board. Yes, today on Dragon's Teeth, we're talking about ideas for books. Hi, I'm Rob White, and thanks for joining me today, where we continue our discussion on self publishing. So, yes, I think as we established last time, first thing you need if you're going to write a book is the idea for the book. Let's look at non fiction first, because in many ways this is easier than coming up with ideas for fiction. So, with non fiction, there's usually a topic that we're interested in, or perhaps we've got some expertise in, or it might even just be about ourselves or someone else. So we can think of biographies, autobiographies. We can think about topics like history. Now, that might be the history of your area. It could be aspects of social history, military history, political history, and so on. Of course, a non-fiction book might be instructional. How to do woodworking, how to play the guitar, how to crochet, or even things like getting into areas of health, fitness, that sort of thing. I guess alongside that, we can think of books that are guides. So we see guides to the internet, guides to computing, also, of course, geographical guides, a guidebook of a particular town or city or area. And then I suppose a little mixture of some of those things can be books that talk about people and their relationships. So, books on psychology, books on various forms of therapies, or again, coming back to that idea of health and well-being. So, the first thing is you've got your area of particular interest. The next thing to think of is what sort of person are you aiming at? Let's say you want to write something about the history of your area, local history. Are you looking for a sort of general guidebook? You know, the sort of thing you pick up if you're visiting somewhere, tells you a little bit about the history of each of the main buildings or the people, that kind of stuff. Or are you going to be producing a very in-depth look at the history of an area, perhaps as it relates to a particular event or person? Of course, what you choose here is going to affect not only the type of book, but also things like the amount of research you have to do as well. So, if you are going to go in depth on a particular topic, one question you have to ask yourself as well is what is my level of expertise and knowledge in this area? Now, that's not to say that you need to know everything about something in order to be able to write about it. And one of the joys of writing, sometimes, not always, is the research you do. Because often in the research, you are educating yourself as well. You're finding out a lot more about your particular subject, and you might also find little rabbit holes that you can go down that will maybe give you other ideas for your book or perhaps for future books as well. Another way to look at it, let's say we're going to do a beginner's guide to car maintenance, for example, an area I know very little about. In that sense, you could present the book as, right, I've opened the bonnet, I've got this mass of wires and bits and pieces. What the bloody hell do I do now? So, in some ways, not knowing so much about your subjects can feed in to the tone and character of your book. So, having those two things in place, an idea of the subject and the type of person I'm pitching at or the type of book I want to produce, you can start thinking about what material do you need. And the way I normally approach this is to write out the title of the book, a short sentence or two of what the book is about, and then write chapter headings. So as an example, a book I'm planning at the moment for my martial arts series is on movement, the basic forms of movement that we have in a particular martial art that I practice. So, Systema Movement is the title. The sentence, the description will be a guide to various movement drills practiced within Systema, ways to enhance and improve your movement. And then I'll think chapters. So there'll be an introduction, because normally with any book, you're going to open with a little bit about yourself and the subjects, perhaps your background in it. Then chapter 1, posture, because if you're talking about movement, you've got to start with posture. Chapter 2, how do you walk? Chapter 3, getting up, sitting down. Chapter 4, moving around on the floor. Chapter 5, how to move if someone's grabbed hold of you. All these sort of things. So my chapter headings, if you like, give me the particular topics within my main subject area that I can focus on. And it's good, if you can, to build these up in a logical progression. So let's say I'm planning a book on the history of my local area, the history of North Bedfordshire. I start with my introduction, and for that sort of history, it makes perfect sense to start, I guess, in the Bronze Age. I think there were certainly people around here in the Iron Age, but I'm going to start with my earliest first and then go all the way through to modern times. That's non-fiction. Generally, that will be the acceptable approach. Now, if you're writing fiction, of course, you can jump backwards and forwards. And I'm just reading a very interesting book called Hawksmoor, which jumps between the 17th century in London, when Hawksmoor was building his churches, and modern day, which involves a murder case centered around some of those churches. So yes, in fiction, you can switch backwards and forwards. That's one of the beauties in fiction. But generally speaking, for non-fiction, you want to make it very easy for the reader to follow your progression, whether that's an argument or a timeline or a set of instructions to do something. Again, if we go back to the car example, step 1, open the bonnet. Even I know that. Now, we're going to talk about the physical format and layout of the book in a future episode, so we'll get onto that later on. Having established that basic idea now, though, for non-fiction, let's move to fiction. In some ways, it's very much the same process. The difficulty you have with fiction is you can do literally anything, right? You're not restricted to history. You're not restricted to the laws of physics. You can write about alien dimensions. You can set your story 5 million years in the future. Okay, so basically you've got this whole huge canvas of time and space to work with. Or, that doesn't mean to say that your story might be about one person sitting in a room doing something, right? That can work as well. So, where do you get your ideas from? Now, if you speak to any author, they'll all tell you something different, but also something broadly the same. A lot of authors will tell you, if they're writing historical fiction, for example, which is, drawing on that non-fiction area, then you might read a story about the Viking invasion of East Anglia, and you think, oh, that would make a great setting for a story about a young warrior and he comes across and, all that sort of thing. Or it could be actual historical events. We could think of the South Sea Bubble. do you remember learning that at school? So, it could be a political event, and you might want to take a fictional approach. You invent some characters, but you're putting them into that historical setting. Obviously, there's a ton of this stuff around, from stories about Spartans and Romans all the way through to stories about the Second World War and the Cold War and beyond. So history and fact can provide a very fertile ground for fiction. Of course, what you then have to do with this, we come back to that idea of research. So I mentioned last episode, I'm currently working on a book called Queen of the Fens, which is set in Roman Britain. I think it's 210 AD. So we're post the Boudica rebellion, but we're not quite at the time when the Romans are leaving Britain. And there's a lot of research to be done because it's not a historical book. It is fiction. The characters are all fictional, as far as I know, but you want to get that setting right. Now, how far you want to go into that is up to you. There are some authors who really become experts in the particular period they're talking about, and they'll tell you how many buttons an American Civil War general had on his coat, really fine tuned details. And I'm reminded of my old mate Tim Mendes, because every author has this story as well. He wrote a story set in World War II, and he spoke about a particular engine as part of the story. Something was going on, and he got an email in saying, actually, I think you'll find that engine had the WS-40 rotavator, and so whatever level of detail you work to, there's always going to be someone who pulls you up on something. I think the main thing for me is that what is happening doesn't take you out the narrative. So if you're writing a book about 1066, now there's a great example, right, of a historical event that could provide all sorts of fictional stories. So you've got the Battle of Hastings coming on, and someone comes flying over in a Spitfire. Then, of course, that immediately takes you out of the narrative, unless there's some sort of time travel element involved, of course. But you wouldn't expect to see a Spitfire in 1066. So the level of detail and research you go to is largely down to you. Personally, I'd rather keep the plot going and the plot moving, particularly because I'm working more in sort of sword and sorcery type fiction, which typically is much more about plot and driving the action forward rather than minute detail. So to some extent, that will depend on what sort of fiction you're writing as well. Of course, if you're writing historical fiction, then you do have the big advantage of people are reasonably familiar with that world. I think one reason that so many of us write ghost stories or horror stories in Victorian London, for example, is everyone understands cobbled streets, fog. There's a guy lurking in an alleyway with a top hat and a big knife, right? You don't have to do a lot of work to set up that atmosphere, to set up that feel. Again, depending on what sort of story you're writing. Now, things can become a little more complex if you set up your own world. So this is most likely for a fantasy novel or for sci-fi. How much do you establish the setting before you get into the story? And again, here, there's so many different ways of approaching this. I'd say the best thing to do is have a look around and read as many authors as you can in that particular genre. Now, what you may find is, as I alluded to at the start, you think you've come up with a brilliantly original idea. No one's ever thought of this before. And maybe you have, but chances are you probably haven't. Someone's done it before. It's exactly the same in music now. How many notes are there? How many combination of those notes? You combine those with certain rhythms and beats. It's very difficult to produce music now. And I'm not talking about sort of improvisational music or that kind of thing. It's very difficult to produce something that doesn't sound a bit like, oh, that sounds a bit like Blondie, that sounds a bit like the Beatles, that sounds a bit like, Iron Maiden or whatever it is. But here's the other thing as well, because I think fiction at the moment is very much bound by genre as well. If we look back to the days of the pulps, Robert E. Howard, Lovecraft, Clark Ashton Smith and the like, most what we'd call today weird fiction, horror, sci-fi was called fantasy, quite often with a PH. That was all lumped under one heading. And it's only as we come through into the 40s, the 50s, the 60s that we start to get these divisions into sci-fi or science fiction, as it was originally called. Then we get fantasy, but then even fantasy itself. High fantasy, Lord of the Rings, Sword and Sorcery, Conan. Low fantasy, Fritz Lieber's Farford and the Grey Mouser. You know, we start to get all these little subdivisions, and nowadays there's grimdark, there's grim light. I don't know. There's all sorts of things. There's urban fantasy, so genre has become a big consideration, and I think maybe in earlier times people just wrote, and it was what it was. Now again, I can relate this to my music experiences because if you're writing in a particular genre, there are certain expectations. So if I put this into my music terms, I once played in a band called the Von Nitros, which was sort of trashy garage surf punk type music. Very abrasive, very aggressive, very straightforward, but filled with lots of energy. We went in for one of those horrible band competitions once. I don't know why, but we did. Uh, we lost the judges' vote, but we won the audience vote, which was very interesting. So we did get through to the final. And the band we lost it to were a rock band who were very adept, or the guitarist at least was very adept in widdly widdly widdly, tapping, is it called, or shredding, that kind of stuff. And one of the judges' comments was, "Oh yes, well obviously the rock band are much better musicians than the other lot." I felt like sitting down and ripping out my toccata and fugue there and then, but the thing is, if the genre is trashy surf punk, that's what you play, right? I'm not breaking out into a minuet or whatever just to show how well I can play. It's two or three chords delivered with energy. So the same thing in writing. If you're writing a gritty western, then there's certain expectations. You're not suddenly going to have an alien invasion or even other less obvious things, you know. So don't worry too much about being startlingly original, because the other thing is, they say there's only, is it 7 or 8 stories? Basically, we're all drawing from that same pool, but it's not so much what you do, but the way that you do it, as someone once saying. So we might even take that basic plot I spoke about earlier. Normal guy finds a magic ring, it's got all sorts of untold powers, and it actually relates to this huge series of events that are happening all over the world. It just so happens to all be focused on this one particular item. Now, of course, Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, and all the rest of it, but lots of other people, especially since Tolkien's success, have taken that idea and run with it. And I'm sure there are examples before Tolkien as well, because of course he had his own influences that he was drawing on. So it might be that you think, well, surely that idea has been done to death, but has it? Maybe you could make the item not a ring, but some other type of artifact. Maybe your protagonist is not a halfling, but is another type of person. Perhaps they're in a particular situation with their family. You can start weaving in all these different things, and by doing that, the basic plot remains broadly similar, that skeleton, if you like, but as you begin to flesh it out, it can take on a very different character. Now, I suppose it may be not the best example, but you see this in lampoons, right? And if you've ever read Board of the Rings, you'll know exactly what I mean, but I'm not going to go into any more detail on that. And I think the other important thing as well is you write with your own voice. Now, again, I can relate this to music because when pretty much everyone starts out playing music, they play covers. Gradually, you start to write your own songs, and gradually, hopefully, your skill in songwriting begins to develop as you go along. So it's the same in writing. There's nothing wrong with trying to write in the style of Lovecraft or Robert E. Howard or Frederick Forsyth or whoever it is. In some ways, it can be a good exercise in that it gets you writing, and you start to get a feel of sentence construction, plot construction, and all the rest of it. But gradually over time, you need to develop your own voice as well. And when we interviewed Ramsey Campbell on the Innsmouth Book Club podcast a while back, something he said famously happened to him was when he first began writing at the age, I think he was like 15, 16. He wrote Lovecraftian stories. He sent them over to August Derleth, who said, yeah, these are great, but don't set them in Arkham and Innsmouth. Set them in where you live. And of course, since then, Ramsay has gone on to develop this whole mythology about his own area of Cheshire and Liverpool and the surrounding areas. And his stories, as he says, much the better for it, because now he's writing about something he knows, something he feels. So he takes those Lovecraftian themes and he brings them into a very different area. Speaking of which, we haven't really spoken about length. I was reminded of a joke that, of course, is going to go into one of my so-called humorous stories about I've just finished writing a book. Oh, what's it about? About 300 pages. So, what length of story or book do you plan to write? Some people dive straight in with a novel. For a novel, I guess you're looking at 50,000 words plus. I just bought a book the other day that is 700 pages. It relates to that book I'm writing because it's about Boudica. And this is just one little part of her life. 700 pages for a historical novel. That's quite a lot to get through. Personally, I'll probably start with some short stories. In fact, that's what I did. Look at maybe even just a couple of thousand words, even if it's something just describing what you can see out your window. Maybe you see someone walking by. Describe them. What are they like? Where do you think they may be going? What are they doing? What secrets do they hide? These can all give you ideas as well as providing you with an instant subject to write about. So again, I'm going to get into the idea of plot development and formatting your book and everything else later on. But for now, let's take that same approach as we did to the non-fiction. Even if it's a short story, even if it's 3,000 words, write the title of your story. The Thing in the Churchyard. A little précis of what the story is about. A man is walking home drunk from the pub one night. He hears a strange noise in the churchyard. He climbs over the wall to investigate. What he sees there chills his bones. And then you can write out, now you're not writing in chapters necessarily, but you can write out what they call the plot beats. So, intro, who's the man, where's he going, where's he been? Next one, he hears a sound, he climbs over the church wall. Next one, he stumbles through the long weeds and the damp grass towards the sound. Next one, he sees a light, and so on and so on. So again, this gives you the bones of your story, and then it's a matter of filling in all the rest. And just to go back to ideas, again, where do these ideas come from? On the Innsmouth Book Club just this week, we interviewed Ali Wilkes, who's an excellent writer. She's written 2 books set in the Arctic and Antarctic, which are really great. I suppose you call them survival horror with supernatural elements. Two great books, and also a young adult Lovecraftian book as well, Jamie Hallows and the End of the World. So really excellent writer. And of course, we always ask authors when they come on, it's a bit of a boring question, but you have to ask it, where do you get your ideas from? And the ideas for her polar books, she said, came from her interest in the polar expeditions, in sort of late Victorian into the Edwardian 20th century era. That's an area that's full of drama and has its own type of particular horror and bravery and all the rest of it. So a lot of potential there for stories. But then she also said that the idea for a Jamie Hallows novel came from a line that just pops into her head. And I can't quote it exactly, but it was something like, people are in the bunker, they daren't go outside because of the radiation from the fallout, because of the driving rain and hailstones, and because of the Shoggoths. So straight away, you've established your setting, you've established your mood, and you've mentioned Shoggoths. Anyone who's into Lovecraft is going to be looking at that. So that sort of idea can pop up any time, and this is why every writer needs not a notebook, several notebooks, and a pen. Keep one by the side of the bed, keep one in your office, keep one in the car. I've got, I don't know, there's about 10 of these scattered around the house. And when you get an idea, write it down. I know there's a very famous writer who said, don't write your ideas down, because if you forget them, then it wasn't a very good idea. I would respectfully disagree with that, because what happens to me is I might think of a line or a quote, and I was, oh, right. And then the phone rings and I have a conversation with someone, and then I have to go online to send an email. 30, 40 minutes later, oh shit, what was that again? So write it down straight away. I've had ideas come in dreams, not very often, but the most striking case was uh, a dream I had about being in a very peculiar setting of corridors underground, and everything was very yellow. This was before I'd seen Backrooms, by the way. It really resonated when I saw Backrooms because it was very similar, and that spawned a story which then blossomed into an anthology called Corridors, which were all in this sort of post apocalyptic setting, but all revolved around the King in Yellow. You'll have to look at the collection to see more about that. So, again, an idea from a dream. Lovecraft famously got a lot of ideas from dreams. Have that pad by the side of your bed. As soon as you wake up, if the idea is there, write it down. This does lead to strange things. And as you may have heard, if you listen to our podcast, to this day, I don't know what 300 horses means that is written in my notebook. I woke up in the middle of the night or early morning and I wrote 300 horses and went back to sleep. I still don't know what it means. If anyone out there has got any ideas, let me know. Could have been the best story ever, right? We shall never know. Now, the other thing you have to be aware of is, you might get pages and pages of notes and little scribblings and all that kind of stuff. By the way, don't be afraid to write things down if you read them in a book. I quite often see a good line in a book and I'll write it out. Not necessarily that I'm going to copy that verbatim, but the way it is structured or the particular way that it describes something. I saw one recently in a book where the crows are on the ground, and as the man comes in, the crows will take off, and it was like the crows rose like smoke or something like that. So, a very evocative image. So, like I say, it's not necessarily copying that, but that gives you an idea of how you can describe things in different ways rather than the crows all took off. It becomes something much more memorable and poetic. And yeah, what you need to do every week or whatever it is go through all of these notes and put them into another book. Did I mention you need another book as well? What I do, I have 3 or 4 separate pads. So one is my horror fiction, one is my sword and sorcery, one is for a particular book I'm working on, like Queen of the Fens, and I'll transfer those ideas into that book so I've got them all in the relevant place. Then when I start writing, I can consult that and I say, oh yeah, that was the idea, and then we need to work that in, and we've got that particular description is good. So then you start to bring all those ideas together. Otherwise, you just end up with loads of notebooks. Another thing you can do, by the way, is send messages to yourself. I do this a lot, partly with manuscripts, so I know that there's a record out there in the ether online, and I can go into my messenger and I can download it, or I've emailed it to myself somewhere. Of course, you can put stuff up on the cloud, you can put stuff up on hard drives. You can never have too many copies. And I imagine, again, I know the same is true in music. There was a very famous story, I think, about Joy Division, who spent the whole night taping something back in the early days of, you know, creating music with computers. And after about 6 hours, the drive collapsed and it was all lost. So anything that you write, make copies, make copies, make copies. Put it on a USB stick, put it on an external drive, send it to yourself, put it in the cloud. And it's unbelievable to me how back in the day when you read the letters between Lovecraft and Smith and all the rest of them, how often they would be sending each other manuscripts through the post. And there are examples of those manuscripts being lost and people having to write out the whole story again. I think it happened to Robert E. Howard in particular. He had to sit down and write out a whole story again. Can you imagine? So there we go. I hope that's given you some insight on where to get ideas from. Basically, just be open. It doesn't have to be an area that you're particularly interested in that will give you an idea. In fact, sometimes it's even better if it comes from a sort of random place. It might be a lot less obvious then when you start developing your plot. For non-fiction and for fiction as well, another great thing that Ali Wilkes mentioned was it really, really helps if it's something you are very interested in. And I know of writers who have been commissioned to write pieces on certain subjects, and it's money, so not many artists can afford to turn that down. And you might think, oh, yeah, that's easy, I can knock off 10,000 words on that. But if it's not a subject you're particularly interested in, maybe you're not too familiar with, you're potentially setting yourself up for a lot of work. And once you get into that research, particularly if it's historical, or again for your non-fiction, you know, if you don't really have much of an interest in that subject, that's going to be a real slog to get through all that research as well. Because writing should be enjoyable. At times it can be hugely frustrating, of course. You might be stuck on a particular plot point, or it's just not happening. But overall, it's a very enjoyable experience because you're either presenting your knowledge in a way to help people, maybe to educate them, maybe to promote a similar interest in them, or you are creating this new world. Whether it's historical world or whether it's an alien planet, that is something that you are creating. And if other people can get enjoyment out of that, then, well, that's what writing's all about. Thanks again for joining me today. As always, please do keep your comments, questions, and suggestions coming in. You can drop me an email at dragoteeth@outlook.com or pop a comment down below. Always interested to hear from other writers, what their process is. It's an endlessly fascinating subject for me, this idea of creativity and where ideas come from. And of course, if you haven't already, please do like, share and subscribe to the channel. It really does help. And if you want to do one single thing to help any writer, subscribe to their work, whether that's on YouTube or Patreon or whatever it is, and also where you can leave reviews. Doesn't have to be a huge elaborate review, even just a couple of lines to say you enjoyed a book. That's really the best thing you can do to help an author, apart from buying their books, of course. Okay, keep your pencil sharp, and I'll see you next time.